January cold locked the lakefront in silence. A fortified estate overlooking Minnesota's frozen shoreline stood dark against the snow. At 3:47 a.m., that quiet ended when more than 100 federal agents closed in from every direction, moving without sirens, without warning, executing a plan that had taken more than a year to assemble. The property was held through a Delaware-registered holding company, masking the identity of its owner. Public records showed a chain of corporate entities stretching across multiple states. At the center of that structure was a man widely known in local business and community circles for philanthropy, import-export ventures, and financial services. On paper, the operation looked ordinary. To federal investigators, it had become something else entirely. The investigation began months earlier with a single electronic transfer. In August 2024, Treasury analysts monitoring high-risk financial activity noticed a payment of $4.7 million moving from a Minnesota nonprofit into an overseas account in Panama. The nonprofit claimed to provide childcare and social support for low-income families. The receiving account, however, was tied to a foreign energy firm under long-standing U.S. sanctions. That mismatch triggered a deeper review. Analysts traced the funds backward through a network of domestic banks, shell companies registered in multiple states, and digital currency exchanges operating in Asia. Each layer added complexity, but the destination stayed consistent. Money originating from public assistance programs was being routed outside the United States into entities that were not supposed to be doing business with American institutions. By late 2024, financial crime units had identified similar patterns across more than a dozen programs. Transactions were broken into small amounts to avoid automatic reporting, then reassembled in foreign accounts. The cumulative total climbed rapidly. What initially appeared to be a single suspicious transfer expanded into a system that had quietly moved billions over several years. Earlier fraud prosecutions in Minnesota had already revealed widespread misuse of pandemic-era relief funding. Dozens of defendants were charged and hundreds of millions of dollars were documented as lost. Yet new financial mapping suggested those cases were only part of a larger structure. Money was not simply being stolen. It was being processed, transferred, and converted through international channels with industrial efficiency. By mid-2025, federal agencies established a joint monitoring center in downtown Minneapolis. Analysts worked in rotating shifts, tracking bank activity, encrypted communications, and digital wallets. One name appeared again and again across the data. The same set of companies, real estate holdings, and money service businesses kept intersecting at key transfer points. Records showed wire movements totaling more than $80 million over an 18-month period, all passing through that network. The businesses involved were properly licensed. Taxes were filed. Charitable donations were publicly listed. None of it raised alarms in isolation. Together, the pattern told a different story. Court-authorized intercepts added another layer. In recorded calls from the fall of 2025, the network's central operator discussed overseas clearances, energy shipments, and protections that came from political connections far beyond Minnesota. Analysts compared those conversations with sanctions databases and foreign intelligence reports. Names and code phrases matched figures linked to narcotics corridors and state-protected smuggling routes in South America. By the end of the year, investigators concluded that funds taken from U.S. assistance programs were being exchanged for profits generated by restricted petroleum sales abroad, then returned through cryptocurrency and offshore banking as apparently legitimate revenue. The cycle was complex, but the logic was consistent. Public money entered one end and reappeared cleansed on the other. That understanding set the timeline in motion. Warrants were prepared for properties in multiple states. Specialized teams were assigned to financial centers, warehouses, and residences tied to the network. The lakefront estate in Minnesota was designated the primary target. Shortly after 3:22 a.m., on January 6, the order to proceed was transmitted. Teams rolled toward their assigned locations. When armored vehicles reached the frozen driveway overlooking the lake, the operation that had been built in quiet offices and digital surveillance rooms moved into the open, marking the first visible step in dismantling a system that had been running for years beneath the surface. At 3:49 a.m., the reinforced front doors of the estate gave way. Agents moved room to room with night vision equipment and trained dogs, securing hallways, staircases, and service corridors. The property was larger than it appeared from the shoreline, with multiple wings, underground levels, and interior security systems designed more like a private facility than a family home. The primary resident was located in the kitchen. He did not attempt to flee. He raised his hands as agents entered and was escorted away without physical resistance. Other occupants were separated and held while the structure was cleared. No charges were filed against them, but the building itself became a secured federal scene. What changed the scope of the case was not the arrest. It was what lay below the main floor. Behind a concealed doorway, agents found a reinforced chamber built into the foundation of the house. Thick walls, biometric locks, and climate-controlled storage gave it the appearance of a private vault. Inside, stacks of U.S. currency were arranged in sealed bundles, sorted by denomination. Over several hours, teams documented and counted more than $40 million in physical cash. Alongside the currency were rows of containers holding documents, electronic devices, and encrypted storage drives. Ledgers written in abbreviated codes listed hundreds of entries tied to public programs, overseas corporations, and financial routing points. Each page appeared to link domestic relief funding to foreign clearing accounts. Digital evidence expanded the picture further. Agents recovered multiple mobile phones configured with advanced security software and custom communication protocols. The devices stored contact lists under code names and location tags. Messages referenced shipments, clearances, and payment cycles, many of them dated across a period of several years. Forensic specialists began extracting data immediately. Wallet addresses for major cryptocurrencies were discovered, some holding balances that reached into the hundreds of millions when converted to U.S. dollars. The transaction history showed funds moving between offshore platforms, private exchanges, and accounts tied to U.S.-based money service businesses. Paper records connected those digital trails back to the same corporate structures that investigators had been monitoring. Shell companies in Panama, the Caribbean, and the Middle East appeared repeatedly as intermediaries. Each served as a pass-through point, separating the original source of the money from its eventual return. Among the documents were foreign identification papers and travel records indicating high-level access in multiple jurisdictions. Photographs and meeting logs placed the network's central operator alongside individuals known to be involved in protected shipping routes and restricted commodity trading. As analysts continued decrypting the seized phones, a consistent operating method emerged. Funds taken from domestic assistance programs were pooled through licensed money transmitters, broken into small transactions and routed overseas. Those funds were then used to acquire restricted energy shipments through black market channels. After resale, the proceeds returned through digital currency and offshore banks, appearing as legitimate profits inside the United States. By midday, the Minnesota estate was no longer just a crime scene. It had become a physical record of an international financial loop that tied local fraud to global trade violations. The material collected there would drive the next phase of the operation, as teams in other states prepared to open doors, seize accounts, and confront the rest of the network built around it. While agents were still cataloging evidence at the lakefront estate, other teams moved on properties tied to the same financial web. In South Minneapolis, a warehouse registered as an import-export hub was entered just after dawn. From the outside it looked like a standard logistics site. Inside it told a different story. Rows of shipping files detailed containers routed through major U.S. ports. The listed cargo was ordinary, machinery, textiles, consumer electronics, but inspection history showed repeated anomalies. Federal interdiction records from the previous year revealed that several of those containers had been stopped in Texas after imaging scans detected hidden compartments. Inside were large quantities of cocaine concealed within industrial equipment. The shipments had been seized, but no arrests were made at the time. Now, the reason was documented in the warehouse itself. Payment ledgers listed transfers to customs brokers, port workers, and freight coordinators, each paid in structured amounts designed to avoid scrutiny. These were not one-off bribes. They formed a consistent system that allowed certain containers to move through ports without inspection, linking narcotics trafficking to the same financial channels that carried misused public funds. Financial records stored on site showed money flowing from Minnesota into similar businesses in Texas and Florida, all operating under the same service model. Each handled cash exchanges, international remittances, and cryptocurrency conversions. Together, they formed a decentralized banking layer that allowed billions to pass through without triggering conventional controls. As those discoveries were being made, the arrests in Minnesota set off immediate public reaction. In neighborhoods where many of the targeted businesses operated, crowds gathered outside community centers and municipal buildings. Demonstrators called for transparency and questioned the scope of the enforcement actions. Local leaders issued statements urging calm while demanding clarity about who had been taken into custody and why. Federal officials responded with data rather than rhetoric. In a briefing held the following day, charts were presented showing years of financial flows, property acquisitions, and offshore transfers. Authorities confirmed dozens of arrests across multiple states and the seizure of assets valued in the billions, including real estate, vehicles, and frozen accounts. Tensions escalated when a separate immigration operation in the city resulted in a fatal shooting. The incident intensified protests and placed the financial investigation inside a much broader conflict over enforcement, civil rights, and public trust. Streets that had been quiet hours earlier filled with demonstrators, media crews, and law enforcement vehicles. Behind the scenes, analysts continued tracing the foreign side of the network. Communications retrieved from the seized devices identified contacts tied to senior figures in a South American government long associated with protected smuggling routes. Messages referenced energy shipments, diplomatic clearances, and secure banking channels, linking the Minnesota operation to overseas authorities who could guarantee that transactions moved without interference. By the end of the week, investigators had mapped a structure that stretched from local nonprofits and money service offices to international shipping lanes and sanctioned commodity markets. The operation was no longer defined by a single estate or warehouse. It had become a case study in how domestic fraud, organized trafficking, and political protection could converge into a single, self-sustaining system. The foreign side of the operation came into focus through weeks of forensic work on seized devices and recovered documents. Analysts reconstructed encrypted conversations that connected the Minnesota-based financial network to senior figures inside a South American government. These were not casual contacts. They were officials who controlled access to shipping lanes, customs approvals, and diplomatic documentation used to move restricted commodities through international markets. Messages showed that energy shipments banned under U.S. sanctions were still being exported through shadow channels. The paperwork attached to those cargoes carried false certifications, altered ownership records, and diplomatic seals that shielded them from inspection. Once sold on the international market, the proceeds were routed through a web of shell corporations, private exchanges, and digital wallets before being returned to the United States as seemingly legitimate investment revenue. Financial analysts mapped more than $3 billion moving through this cycle between 2022 and 2025. That figure represented only what could be traced with existing records. Offshore jurisdictions with strict secrecy laws and unregulated cryptocurrency platforms held far more that remained out of reach. Every layer was designed to delay, obscure, and fragment the trail. As the foreign connections were being dismantled, the domestic consequences were becoming impossible to ignore. In Minnesota, programs funded by the same pools of money had already begun collapsing. Childcare providers reported months of unpaid reimbursements. Housing agencies froze new assistance applications. Medical clinics that depended on state billing cycles cut services or closed entirely. What had been a financial crime on paper translated into disrupted lives in practice. Community organizations faced their own reckoning. Many had relied on donations from businesses now under federal seizure. Youth programs, food drives, and neighborhood initiatives discovered that their funding had originated from stolen public money. Trust evaporated quickly. Leaders who had been seen as benefactors were now viewed as intermediaries in a system that had drained resources from the very populations it claimed to support. Federal regulators responded with emergency measures. Treasury issued new compliance directives for money service businesses. State agencies launched audits of grant programs that had not been reviewed in years. Banking institutions were instructed to retroactively examine transfers linked to overseas energy trades in high-risk jurisdictions. Each agency acknowledged the same reality: the fraud had not gone unnoticed because it was invisible. It had gone unnoticed because oversight systems were not built to handle networks this complex. Legal proceedings advanced on multiple fronts. Defense teams prepared arguments claiming improper surveillance and procedural violations. Prosecutors assembled transaction records, decrypted communications, and foreign financial statements that spanned several years. The case was no longer about a single defendant. It was about proving that an international infrastructure had existed to move public money into protected criminal economies and back again. Behind closed doors, federal investigators identified dozens of additional suspects across multiple states. Some were operators. Others were facilitators, accountants, brokers, logistics coordinators, and financial technicians who had helped the system function. More warrants were being drafted. More assets were marked for seizure. The operation that began before dawn on a frozen Minnesota shoreline had triggered something much larger. What was being exposed was not just a fraud scheme, but a blueprint showing how modern financial systems could be exploited across borders, institutions, and governments, leaving communities to absorb the damage while billions disappeared into global networks built to never be fully unwound. By the time the final warrants were executed, the scale of what had been uncovered was no longer measured in single properties or single accounts. It was measured in the gap between what had been taken and what had been recovered. Federal authorities confirmed that just over $1.5 billion in assets had been frozen or seized. Financial analysts estimated that represented barely 1/5 of the total money that had passed through the network. The rest remained scattered across offshore jurisdictions, private cryptocurrency wallets, layered shell companies, and accounts registered under names that had not yet been identified. Some of it sat in countries that did not cooperate with U.S. enforcement requests. Some of it moved so frequently through digital platforms that tracking it became a race against time and technology. Recovery would take years and much of it would never be returned. For Minnesota, the consequences were immediate. State agencies faced multi-billion-dollar shortfalls. Programs that once paid for meals, housing assistance, medical care, and child care subsidies were forced to reduce or suspend services. Families who depended on those programs were left on waiting lists that grew longer by the week. Providers that had already delivered services waited for payments that might never arrive. The financial damage was not abstract. It was felt in closed clinics, unpaid staff, and households pushed closer to instability. At the center of the case, the primary defendant was moved into federal custody, where he awaited trial. Prosecutors prepared charges that included money laundering, conspiracy, and international trafficking violations. Defense attorneys signaled that they would challenge every element of the investigation, from surveillance methods to the authenticity of the foreign financial records. The outcome would determine not only one man's future, but how aggressively similar networks could be pursued in the years ahead. Investigators continued working through a list of more than 100 additional suspects. Some were believed to have played small roles, processing transactions or filing paperwork. Others were suspected of managing entire segments of the operation. More arrests were expected, along with further asset freezes that would ripple through financial institutions and business communities. Internationally, the fallout continued. Foreign accounts linked to the same energy for cash system were being reviewed by partner governments. Shipping firms, insurers, and commodity brokers were forced to re-examine years of transactions. The global trade routes that had quietly enabled the laundering cycle were suddenly under scrutiny. What remained unresolved was the long-term impact. Communities that had trusted local organizations now questioned where their support had truly come from. Regulators debated how to balance tighter controls with the need for financial services in underserved areas. Law enforcement agencies faced pressure to show that such a massive failure of oversight would not be repeated. The lakefront estate in Minnesota stayed sealed behind federal notices, its luxury now standing as evidence of what had been taken. Inside, the cash, digital keys, and documents told a story of systems that had been exploited until billions vanished. Outside, a city and a state dealt with the reality that the cost of that exploitation would be paid not by the architects alone, but by the people who had relied on the programs that were drained to make it possible. The investigation did not end with the final raid. It continued through courtrooms, financial ledgers, and international requests for cooperation. The numbers were still changing. The suspects list was still growing. And the question that remained was not whether the system had failed, but how many similar structures might still be operating beyond the reach of what had just been uncovered.